Voting time is always intense. Either you have really strong opinion on which party is best and why people should vote for it, or you find yourself constantly being pestered about your opinion when, quite frankly, you're on the fence on many issues and can't find a party that really seems to fit. But something that I found most interesting during voting time was when votes were used as a bargaining chip. Not in a large-scale corruption kind of way, but in a family. For legal reasons, this is a totally made-up example. But let's say most people in this family don't particularly care for any particular party. The mom, however, really likes the party of the current president, in part because they have good social policies that she really supports them, and in part because the president is a total hunk and seeing him at the 8 o'clock news is way more interesting than some old dude. So a system developed. For each vote that one person of the family is willing to give to the mom, she makes his or her favorite dish, buying votes through cooked meals and baked goods. Now, while you might at first glance think that this is wrong, let me ask you this. If we follow the very known slogan of no taxation without representation, isn't the conclusion that we kind of do the same? That by paying taxes, we buy our right to partake in the decision-making? We're willing to invest in the system through money, and in return, we get a say in how it is spent. Well, this mom invests food to get a little extra say. Who's to blame her? Today's episode is centered around the famous slogan, no taxation without representation. And we will look at its history, what exactly it means, and what happens when the tables are turned. Welcome to Rebel Economics, where we talk about interesting topics in economics and business, and today, even some politics is mixed in there. We're happy to have you with us today. If you like our content, please like and subscribe. So let's get started with the origin of no taxation without representation. The slogan originated in the American Revolution as one of the main grievances of the colonies, as Great Britain decided on taxes willy-nilly without the Americans getting a say in it. One such tax was introduced via the Stamp Act of 1765, and the idea was fairly simple. All legal documents, permits, commercial contracts, newspaper, wills, pamphlets, and playing cards in the American colonies had to carry a tax stamp, so pretty much everything on paper. This accumulated large sums of money for Britain, so much so that it significantly financed the cost of maintaining the military presence in America. But other taxes were added onto this. For example, the Townshend Revenue Act taxing lead, paper, paint, glass, and tea, the Sugar Act taxing sugar, cloth, and coffee, and lastly, the most famous, the Tea Act, which led to the Boston Tea Party. With nearly everything being under some British tax, the Americans got fed up having to pay far higher prices for basic necessities and furious about not having any say in this whatsoever. While the American Revolution was the origin of the slogan, some of us think of it more in the context of early feminist movements. It was one of the core demands until women finally received the vote in 1920. 80 years prior to that, in the 1860s, suffragette Sarah E. Wool initiated an anti-tax protest, encouraging women not to pay taxes until they were granted the right to vote. She stuck to her guns, even when sued by the tax collector, and the court ruled against her. Despite her property being seized by the authorities and sold to come up with the taxes she refused to pay, she did not budge. She continued to refuse paying taxes while not being allowed to vote, until the tax collectors eventually just ignored her. So she really did not pay taxes without getting her representation via the vote for women. Of course, here when we talk about taxes, we focus on income tax and property tax. Things like value-added tax cannot be avoided, even if the tax collector eventually leaves you alone. In the time of the American Revolution, as the slogan first appeared, it was not as clean-cut as it may seem nowadays. As this demand was made, only very few people were eligible to vote, coming to about 3% of British men. And yes, women are of course excluded from the get-go, so really that makes it about 1.5% of the overall population. Or even less, since in that percentage people of color are surely not to be included. So the British response was that the colonies, just as the majority of the British population, has a virtual representation. And no, with that I don't mean that they popped up in Westminster Abbey with VR goggles. Instead, it is meant that more as a represented in spirit kind of thing. This was, of course, rejected by the Americans, wanting real, true representation in order to get to have a say in the taxes which are being passed. The meaning of no taxation without representation rang as true then during the American Revolution as it does nowadays. It represents the firm belief that the government should not tax a populace which is not itself represented in the government. That since taxes are passed by the government exclusively, those who pay them should also be allowed to at least indirectly have a say in which taxes are introduced by voting their representatives, whether this be at the state or the national level. If you leave out the first word, a very different statement is made: taxation without representation. This is exactly what many people are facing. Even nowadays, in Western countries where you are allowed to vote, no matter your ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or any other historically common means of discriminating a group of people, the issue of no taxation without representation is not yet entirely solved. This, for example, is true for immigrants. Let's say you are a French citizen and move to Germany. Well, you would not be allowed to vote in Germany. Even though your entire life is centered there, you have a job and you pay income tax, you would still not be allowed to vote. For you, living in Germany, this would be the political system you would want to influence. After all, it is the one that, for example, determines if an increase in tax will be coming. Yet, the only vote you would get would be in France, despite your economic activity not taking place there. In many European countries, it is quite common that the right to vote can only be obtained by becoming a citizen of the country. Usually, there are certain requirements for having lived in the country a certain number of years, speaking the language, or even a civil test for naturalization. If you are a citizen of a country within the EU, changing or adding a nationality is a lot easier, though, than for people from non-EU countries. The second group are prisoners, and sometimes ex-convicts, who are also excluded from the right to vote. The right to vote for people deprived of their liberty varies widely from country to country, and even within some countries like the US. In some countries, voting rights for prisoners are subject to restrictions and/or conditions. In other countries, people convicted of an offense are automatically disenfranchised for the period of their prison term, or even after they have served their time of parole. Of course, one could argue that during the time of their prison sentence, they also do not pay taxes, which is true, but they probably did pay taxes beforehand, and will do so afterwards again. This is where it becomes especially tricky to justify why an ex-con should no longer be allowed to vote. After all, isn't the sentence meant to rehabilitate them and return them to society with the slate wiped clean? Of course, this is a whole other topic, a very interesting one, but I don't want to go too far off a tangent here. This is the status quo, a depiction of how it is, not how it should be. The same argument is true for a group of people we all either are, will be, or have been a part of. Namely, if you are younger than the official voting age, which in most countries is 18. Yet, in many countries, the mandatory schooling ends before the age of 18, leaving a gap where you could already work but are not yet allowed to vote. This means you too are paying taxes without being represented. So we see the correlation between taxes and representation, or the right to vote, is not always given. There are cases where taxes are paid and yet the right to vote is not given, as for example immigrants and people under 18, for example, experience. Yet, vice versa, in countries where prisoners are allowed to vote, you have the opposite, someone who is not currently paying taxes, yet they do get the right to vote. Or people who emigrated, as they will get to vote in the country where they have their citizenship without paying taxes there. The same, for example, is true for unemployed people. They even get support from the state, so essentially doing the opposite of paying taxes, but they are still eligible to vote. Even though with the current rate of voter disenfranchisement, especially among unemployed people, they often choose not to. Unemployment even has a wider effect. Having been unemployed once will decrease your likelihood to vote by 6 to 13%, according to a study by the European Sociological Review. But again, voter disenfranchisement is another topic for another day. Now let's focus on what happens when you turn the slogan around and the argument of no representation without taxation appears. This is often the case in so-called rentier states. So let's first have a look at what they are and why they oppose this concept. In simple terms, a rentier state is a state that derives most of its revenues from renting resources to a foreign power. The most common resource is oil, and one of the most clean-cut rentier states, for example, would be Saudi Arabia. Here the country has such an abundance of a valuable resource, they do not need to tax their citizens, thus breaking a crucial link between citizens and their government and dimming the prospects for democracy. Since the government does not need the money that taxes provide, they get to sever that connection between paying taxes and getting the right to have a say in how the country is being run. That also means that in those states, democracies do not tend to develop, because this first fundamental step is never taken. This is also why in political sciences, people often speak of a resource curse. I will surely make a video about this soon, so stay tuned or just subscribe so you're always up to date on our newest videos. The right to vote has been fought for hard, first by colonies, which wanted to be represented in the decision-making of new taxes, or best of all, prevent new taxes altogether, and later by the suffragettes. And even though we have come so far, there still are groups for whom this concept does not apply, or at least not always. Some groups of people experience taxation without representation, while others experience representation without taxation. Of course, you can have neither no taxation and no representation, as we have seen in the example of rentier states. I hope you enjoyed this episode and learned something new about the right to vote and how that has an economic link to taxation. If you enjoy the mix of politics and economics, check out our video on whether the euro was a mistake, or why not see why you should only work 4 days a week. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please like and subscribe. See you again soon, here on Rebel Economics.